There's been a series of Russian missile attacks on Ukraine in the last 24 hours, including attacks into residential areas where families and children are living. It appears this may be a response to the attack on the bridge that linked Crimea and Russia. Crimea had been part of Ukraine but was annexed by Russia in 2014. It was also a bridge linked in a way to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He was the person who caused the bridge to be built and was the person who formally opened it. Professor Robert Schirre is a Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Studies at UCT. Professor Schirre, good afternoon to you. We have Ukraine, and I presume it was Ukraine who attacked this bridge. In apparent response, Russia sends missiles into residential areas. Is this the start of a new phase in this war?
Essentially, the core of the matter is that this is a very dynamic situation. In other words, it's not a product of a cool, calculating, pragmatic Putin. It's a man operating under enormous stress and I think under a lot of pressure. Essentially what we're seeing is two different games taking place. The one game is what is happening in the Kremlin, where there is clearly disunity in the elite. The other game is in Ukraine itself with the West and with NATO. And to some extent, these two games are in conflict. What favors Putin in the Kremlin, that is tough action, is in fact a disadvantage with the rest of the world. And I think we are really seeing the third phase. First phase, we know very clearly, was an attempt to conquer the whole of Ukraine and basically annex it into the former Soviet Union. That failed. Second goal was simply to take the Donbass, to bring them into Russia and essentially declare victory. That was the second goal, and now that has failed because of the success of Ukraine. The third goal, which is perhaps more confusing, is an emotional reaction by Putin. As you stated, this bridge, the Kerch Bridge, which apparently was destroyed by a car bomb or damaged, was very symbolic for Putin. So we're now seeing we have a choice because we don't really know. It's either an emotional, vindictive Putin, essentially warning the West, or alternatively, it is a decision to destroy the Ukraine, to make it unlivable with, and essentially let the rest of the world pick up the pieces.
You make the point that it's not a rational game that's being played. But presumably Ukraine, if it was Ukraine, I mean, it must have been Ukraine, right, to attack this bridge. They would have known this. I would think that they would have gamed this out. I realize that they're a group of people under attack, but they would have gamed this out. They would know that Putin would react.
Yeah, of course they did. But if you look at it from the Ukrainian point of view, what choice do they have? The Ukrainians are, in one way, winning the battles, and that is, of course, making military progress, but they're not necessarily winning the war. And by that I mean the Ukrainians have not succeeded and probably cannot succeed in deflecting Putin from his goal of attacking the Ukraine. So there's no question of a total victory on either side. Putin cannot conquer the Ukraine. Ukraine cannot destroy Russian capabilities. And so we are seeing thrashing, hitting out, but no longer a rational plan. Way in which either Russia... Hello?
All right, Professor Schirre, I don't know if you're still with us.
Yes, I'm still with you.
Sorry about that. We lost you there for a minute, but let's continue. You said there was disunity in the Russian elite. What do you base that on?
Well, we are seeing, first of all, for the very first time, important members of the elite critical of the whole campaign. I'm thinking specifically of the Chechen warlords. I'm thinking specifically of the founder of the Wagner group, the mercenary group that are playing a very important role in the Russian attack on Ukraine. Now, essentially, they are not criticizing Putin, but they are criticizing the conduct of the war, which is a code word for attacking Putin. They're attacking the strategies. They're attacking the generals. We are seeing frequent changes in the command of the various Russian forces. So although they are not attacking Putin, the obvious point to make is that Putin is the man who appointed all of these generals and commanders, and he's also the man we know who is the mastermind behind the detailed tactics. So when you attack the people around Putin, you are code form attacking Putin.
There are many dynamics to all of this, Professor, as you will know better than I. So you've got the war between Russia and Ukraine. You've got the war between, if you like, and I realize that I'm going to step on toes here, the war between the West and Russia. You've also got, perhaps another way, the contest between Western ideals, in inverted commas, I mean, they're not ideals to many people, and Putinism, sort of slightly what I would see as a dictatorial rule. And there are ways that this plays out. So one example would be the conscription campaign in Russia, where 300,000 people, young men, are going to be conscripted. That immediately makes people make decisions about their families. Should my son stay in Russia with his family, with his wife, where he will be conscripted, or must I send him to Kazakhstan, which in fact many people have done? There's a whole lot of pressure building up in lots of different ways. You make the point about a lack of rationality. So if this pressure builds up in lots of different ways, what happens next? Could something unexpected and dramatic happen?
Well, the critical question, which we can't really answer, is what will happen if and when Putin goes. Now, at the moment, the prevailing wisdom, which I partly share, is that Putin is invulnerable. He is sitting on top of a powerful machine and nobody can replace him. But there are many people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was once Russia's wealthiest man and a very powerful man, who believes that Putin, in fact, is on his way out. Now, either way, the question is, what are the political trends in Russia which will determine what happens in the Ukraine? If Putin goes, will a more warlike, more efficient elite take over, or will they sue for peace? At the moment, it's very difficult to see how anybody on either side can sue for peace. In very specific terms, Russia, whoever is leading it, is not in a position to end the war by accepting defeat. And of course, as we know, the Ukrainians, with all the sacrifices they have made, are not prepared to cede a single inch of territory to the Russians. So we have a typical stalemate which transcends the personalities of Zelensky or of Putin.
You talk about Putin going. Wouldn't he use an atomic bomb first?
The reality is that, as we've said before, Russia is like Upper Volta with nuclear weapons. There is no advantage which Russia has from a military point of view to use nuclear weapons. It simply would be irrelevant and counterproductive. The obvious point to be that it's not going to help Russia conquer Ukraine. It's going to cause an international outcry. It's going to cause radioactive poisoning. It has no military advantage. The only bargaining tool which Putin is obviously using is an attempt to use nuclear weapons to get the West to stop providing modern weaponry to the Ukrainian military. And there it has clearly failed. The bloodshed, the atrocities, the destruction has, I think, fortified the Americans, given the European Union a backbone which it hasn't had before, which make them more determined to continue to support Ukraine. And the fact that Ukraine has been, from a relative point of view, successful militarily, beyond all expectations, I think means that politically it would be very difficult for the West not to continue to support the Ukraine. I think the hope Putin might have had would be at some stage the West, perhaps out of fear of energy crises or heating crises, would begin to de-escalate, stop supporting Ukraine. Instead, what has happened is, I think, that Western support for Ukraine has solidified.
Professor Robert Schirre, thank you so much. Emeritus Professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town.